For 42 years, Arthur Bennett had built restaurants where strangers became regulars, and regulars became friends. He remembered birthdays, favorite tables, wedding anniversaries, even the names of customers' children. When people asked him what made a successful restaurant, they expected him to talk about recipes. Instead, he always smiled and answered, "The food brings people through the door, but kindness brings them back." 10 years ago, Arthur retired. The company he had started with 4 tables and a second-hand stove had grown into one of the country's most respected family restaurant chains. He quietly stepped aside. A new generation took over. Arthur never interfered. The restaurants no longer needed him. Or so he believed. For years he spent his time traveling with his late wife's old leather journal, visiting small towns they had once dreamed of seeing together. He was happy, at peace. Then one ordinary Tuesday morning he decided to visit their very first restaurant. Not as the founder. Not as the former chairman. Simply as a customer. He wanted one bowl of tomato soup, the same soup he and his wife had served on opening day 42 years earlier. He had no idea that before lunch he would be asked to leave his own restaurant. And before the week was over, an entire company would remember what leadership really meant. Arthur parked his 12-year-old station wagon beneath the old oak tree across the street. The restaurant looked both familiar and different. The sign had been replaced. The flower beds were larger. There was an outdoor terrace now. But the front windows, those were exactly the same. He smiled. His wife had insisted on those windows. "People like seeing life before they walk inside," she had said. Arthur quietly laughed to himself. She had been right about almost everything. He reached into the passenger seat and picked up a worn leather shoulder bag. Inside was the same little notebook he had carried since the company's very first day. Every now and then he still wrote ideas in it. Not because anyone would read them, simply because old habits are difficult to forget. As he climbed the short path toward the entrance, the heavy wooden door opened before he could reach it. A young waiter held it with one hand. "Good morning, sir." Arthur smiled. "Thank you." "My pleasure, sir." Arthur noticed the young man's name tag. Ethan Brooks. "How long have you worked here, Ethan?" The young waiter smiled. 2 weeks. Arthur nodded approvingly. "Then you're already doing something right." Ethan laughed politely, not entirely sure what the elderly gentleman meant. Inside the restaurant buzzed with quiet conversation. Families shared breakfast. Retired couples lingered over coffee. Business people glanced at laptops while waiting for meetings. Arthur stood still for just a moment, listening. The sound of plates, the smell of fresh coffee, soft laughter. It felt wonderfully ordinary. Exactly as he had always hoped. A young hostess approached. "Table for one?" Arthur smiled. "If possible. I'd love that corner booth." She checked her tablet. "Of course." She led him across the dining room. Arthur couldn't help smiling. 42 years earlier that booth had been his favorite as well. Not because of the view, because from there, he could quietly watch every guest without disturbing anyone. Old founders, it seemed, never entirely stopped working. As the hostess handed him a menu, Arthur noticed something. The tomato soup was gone. So was the homemade shepherd's pie. His wife's apple crumble had disappeared too. He smiled sadly. Times changed. Menus changed. That was perfectly natural. Still, he couldn't help missing them. A waitress approached. "What can I get for you today?" Arthur looked up with a warm smile. "I know this may sound like a strange question, but would your chef happen to remember the old tomato soup?" She looked puzzled. "I'm sorry, sir. I don't think we've ever served one." Arthur chuckled softly. "Oh, we used to. A very long time ago." He closed the menu. "I suppose I'll have whatever your chef enjoys making most." The waitress smiled. "I'll ask." As she walked away, Arthur looked around the dining room once more. The restaurant was busy, efficient, well organized. Everything appeared to run exactly as it should. He smiled quietly. Perhaps, he thought, everything really was going to be just fine. A few minutes later, Arthur's lunch arrived. The young waitress smiled as she placed the plate in front of him. "Our chef recommends this. It's one of our most popular meals." Arthur looked at the beautifully prepared dish. "It looks wonderful." He took his first bite. The food was excellent. Perfectly seasoned. Beautifully presented. He nodded quietly to himself. The kitchen clearly knew what it was doing. Still, something felt missing. Not in the recipe. In the feeling. As he continued eating, he watched the dining room. The servers moved quickly. Orders arrived on time. Empty glasses were replaced almost immediately. Nobody made mistakes. Everything worked. Almost like clockwork. Yet something caught Arthur's attention. Nobody seemed to know the guests. One elderly couple received exactly the same greeting as customers visiting for the first time. A little boy proudly held up a drawing for his waitress. She smiled politely, but hurried away before he could show it to her. A businessman sat alone by the window. His coffee cup had been empty for several minutes. 3 employees walked past. None of them noticed. Arthur wasn't criticizing anyone. He simply observed. After all these years, he still couldn't stop watching restaurants. Old habits really were difficult to break. A few minutes later, Ethan stopped beside his table. "Everything all right, sir?" Arthur smiled warmly. "The food is excellent." Ethan looked relieved. "I'm glad." Arthur hesitated, then asked, "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "How many regular customers do you have?" Ethan looked surprised. "I honestly don't know." Arthur smiled kindly. "When you've worked somewhere a little longer, try learning their names." Ethan looked puzzled. "The customers?" Arthur nodded. "Especially the customers." Ethan laughed. "That might take a while." Arthur grinned. "The best things usually do." Not far away, Vanessa Reed had been reviewing the lunchtime service from the host's stand. She prided herself on noticing everything. She noticed waiting times, table turnover, server efficiency, customer complaints. As she glanced across the dining room, she noticed Ethan standing beside one table much longer than necessary. She walked over. "Ethan." He turned immediately. "Yes, Ms. Reed? We have customers waiting." "I'm sorry. I was just..." Vanessa smiled professionally. "It's all right. We'll discuss coaching conversations after lunch." Ethan nodded. "Yes, Ms. Reed." He returned to work. Arthur quietly watched him leave. Then Vanessa turned toward Arthur with a courteous smile. I hope everything has been satisfactory. Arthur smiled. Very much so. I'm pleased to hear that. He hesitated for a moment. May I make one small observation? Vanessa smiled politely. We always welcome feedback. Arthur nodded. I noticed your staff work extremely hard. They do. It shows. Vanessa smiled proudly. Arthur continued. I wonder whether they are sometimes so busy serving tables that they don't have time to see the people sitting at them. For just the briefest moment, Vanessa's smile faded. She had heard comments like this before, usually from customers who believed restaurants should still operate the way they had 30 years ago. She answered carefully. We serve nearly 400 guests every day. I understand. We have to balance hospitality with efficiency. Arthur nodded. Of course. I only asked because. He smiled gently. The company was built on both. Vanessa looked at him with polite confusion. I'm sorry? Arthur chuckled softly. Oh, never mind. As Vanessa walked away, she glanced back once. The elderly gentleman had opened a small leather notebook. He was quietly writing something. She frowned. One of the assistant managers approached. Everything okay? Vanessa lowered her voice. I think we may have another one. Another what? Someone pretending to know how the company should be run. She looked across the dining room again. He says the company was built differently. The assistant manager sighed. We've had a few lately. Vanessa nodded. Keep an eye on him. Neither of them noticed Ethan looking back toward Arthur's table. He didn't see a difficult customer. He saw an elderly man eating lunch alone, while writing carefully in a notebook that looked almost as old as the restaurant itself. That made Ethan wonder what story the gentleman carried with him. Arthur remained at his table for another 15 minutes. He wasn't in a hurry. Retirement had quietly removed the need to watch the clock. He finished the last bite of his lunch, folded his napkin carefully, then opened the little leather notebook once again. He wrote only a few lines. The food is excellent. The people are excellent. The pace is too fast for kindness. He smiled. His late wife would probably have crossed out the last sentence. She had always believed criticism should be followed immediately by hope. Arthur turned the page, then added one more line. They only need reminding. He quietly closed the notebook. Ethan happened to pass again. Would you like another coffee, sir? Arthur smiled. I'd love one. I'll bring it right away. As Ethan walked toward the coffee station, Vanessa stepped into his path. Where are you going? Table 12 asked for another coffee. Vanessa looked toward Arthur. He has already finished eating. Yes. So the table needs to be reset. Ethan hesitated. He only asked for a coffee. Vanessa lowered her voice. We have guests waiting. Turnover matters. Ethan nodded reluctantly. Yes, Ems. Read. Arthur noticed the exchange. He simply folded his hands and waited. A moment later, Vanessa approached his table herself. Her smile remained perfectly professional. Mr. Arthur. Mr. Arthur. He chuckled softly. Arthur is fine. Arthur. She nodded politely. I hope you enjoyed your meal. Very much. I'm delighted to hear that. She glanced briefly toward the waiting area. As you may have noticed, we are busy today. Arthur followed her eyes. Several families were indeed waiting near the entrance. I noticed. Vanessa continued. We do have a policy during peak hours. We ask guests to finish their visit once their meal is complete. Arthur smiled kindly. Of course. He reached for his jacket, then paused. I was hoping to finish one more cup of coffee while making a few notes. I'm afraid today won't be possible. Arthur looked at the notebook. I understand. He slowly placed it into his bag. Then, almost absent-mindedly, he asked, May I offer one final thought? Vanessa hesitated, very briefly. Arthur nodded. When people feel hurried, they rarely remember the food. They remember the feeling. Vanessa smiled politely. We appreciate your opinion. Arthur stood. I know you do. He picked up his cane, his leather bag, smiled warmly. Then quietly added, I hope you never become so efficient that people stop feeling welcome. Without another word, he walked toward the entrance. Ethan was standing beside the coffee machine. He watched the elderly gentleman leave. Something didn't feel right. He quickly prepared the coffee anyway, poured it into a takeaway cup, then hurried outside. Sir. Arthur stopped and turned. Ethan caught up with him. I'm sorry. Arthur looked puzzled. For what? You wanted another coffee. He held out the cup. I thought you shouldn't have to leave without it. Arthur looked at the young waiter for several seconds, then smiled. What was your name again? Ethan. Arthur accepted the cup. Thank you, Ethan. I'm really sorry about what happened. Arthur shook his head gently. Don't apologize. You weren't the one making decisions. Ethan looked embarrassed. It still doesn't feel right. Arthur nodded. No, it doesn't. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Arthur asked, Why did you bring me this coffee? Ethan looked genuinely confused by the question. Because, he shrugged. You were our guest. Arthur's smile became a little brighter. There it was. The sentence, he had hoped, still existed somewhere inside the company. He placed a hand gently on Ethan's shoulder. Never lose that. Ethan frowned. Lose what? Arthur looked back at the restaurant. The reason we exist. Before Ethan could ask another question, Arthur walked toward his old station wagon. He climbed inside, started the engine, and quietly drove away. Ethan stood on the sidewalk, holding the empty coffee tray. For reasons he couldn't explain, watching that old station wagon disappear around the corner made him unexpectedly sad. Inside the restaurant, Vanessa glanced through the window. She saw Ethan still standing outside. When he returned, she spoke calmly. Ethan. Yes, Ems, Reed. You have a kind heart. Thank you. But kindness must never interfere with efficiency. Ethan nodded respectfully. Yes, Ems, Reed. He returned to work. But all afternoon, one sentence refused to leave his thoughts. Because you were our guest. Arthur arrived home just before sunset. His little cottage overlooked a quiet lake on the edge of town. It wasn't large. He had never wanted a large house. After retiring, he often joked that he had already spent 40 years living inside restaurants. Now he preferred birdsong to board meetings. He placed the leather shoulder bag on the kitchen table, then carefully removed the notebook. For several minutes, he simply looked at it. Finally, he opened the last page. The food is excellent. The people are excellent. The pace is too fast for kindness. They only need reminding. He read the words twice, then quietly closed the notebook. I hope you're right. The sentence wasn't meant for himself. It was meant for the framed photograph standing beside the window. His wife smiled back at him from a picture taken many years earlier. She wore a flower-covered apron. He was washing dishes. Both of them were laughing. It had been taken on the first anniversary of their first restaurant. Arthur smiled. You always believed people could learn. The following morning, Arthur arrived at the company's headquarters. Very few employees recognized him anymore. That was exactly the way he preferred it. He greeted the receptionist by name. She looked surprised. You still remember? Arthur smiled. I've always believed names are worth remembering. She laughed. I've worked here 12 years. Exactly. He made his way quietly through the building. The walls displayed photographs of the company's growth. Restaurant number 1. Restaurant number 5. Restaurant number 20. Restaurant number 50. Arthur stopped in front of the very first photograph. 4 tiny tables. A handwritten menu. One young couple smiling proudly in front of a restaurant that almost hadn't survived its first winter. A younger executive happened to walk past. He noticed Arthur studying the picture. Beautiful history, isn't it? Arthur nodded. It certainly is. The executive smiled. Hard to believe, they built an entire company from that. Arthur smiled quietly. Yes, it is. A few minutes later, Arthur entered the boardroom. Several directors were already waiting. Conversations stopped almost immediately. Not because Arthur demanded attention, because every person in the room stood up. The chairman smiled warmly. Good morning, Arthur. Arthur shook every hand. Good morning. Thank you for coming. One by one, the directors greeted him. Some had worked beside him for 20 years. Others had only known him through company stories. Arthur treated every greeting exactly the same, warmly, without ceremony. When everyone had taken their seats, the chairman looked around the room. There is one more guest joining us this morning. He glanced toward the door. Our regional manager has just arrived. Arthur folded his hands quietly on the table. He said nothing. He wasn't interested in embarrassing anyone. He simply wanted to understand. Outside the boardroom, Vanessa Reed adjusted the folder beneath her arm. She expected another quarterly performance review. Her restaurant had exceeded every target. Customer wait times were among the lowest in the company. Food costs were under budget. Staff efficiency had improved again. She allowed herself a small smile. This was going to be a good day. She had no idea that the elderly customer she had politely asked to leave the previous afternoon was already waiting inside. The boardroom slowly filled with conversation. Regional managers greeted one another. Coffee cups were placed on the long conference table. Laptops open. Vanessa Reed took her usual seat halfway down the table. She glanced briefly toward the front of the room. An elderly gentleman sat quietly beside the chairman. Something about him seemed vaguely familiar. She couldn't quite place him. Perhaps she'd seen him at a company anniversary years ago. The chairman smiled as the room settled. Good morning, everyone. Before we begin reviewing this quarter's results, I'd like to welcome someone many of you have never met. He turned toward Arthur. Our founder. Arthur Bennett stood. The room immediately applauded. Vanessa politely joined in. Still, she couldn't understand why the gentleman looked familiar to her. Arthur smiled warmly. Please, sit down. I've never been particularly comfortable with ceremonies. A few people laughed. I've always preferred restaurants. More laughter followed. Arthur folded his hands. When my wife and I opened our first restaurant, we had 4 tables. We also had exactly one rule. If a guest walks through our door, they should leave feeling happier than when they arrived. Silence settled over the room. We weren't always successful. We burned soup. We overcooked steaks. We once served coffee without any coffee. The room erupted with laughter. Arthur smiled. We made mistakes, but we tried very hard never to make anyone feel unwelcome. He looked around the table. Recipes changed. Buildings changed. Technology changed. I expected all of that. His smile slowly faded. But yesterday, I discovered something that worried me. Vanessa felt an unexpected tightening in her stomach. Arthur continued quietly. I visited one of our restaurants. I didn't introduce myself. I simply wanted lunch. The room became completely silent. I received excellent food, fast service, a spotless dining room. He nodded appreciatively. It was one of the most efficiently operated restaurants I've visited in years. Vanessa couldn't help feeling proud. Then Arthur continued. But I also watched a little boy trying to show his drawing to a waitress. She didn't have time. I watched an elderly couple greeted exactly like strangers. I watched a guest finish his meal while looking around for someone to talk to. Arthur looked down for a moment, then quietly added, and eventually, I was asked to leave before finishing my coffee. The silence became almost uncomfortable. Vanessa slowly looked up. The memories came back all at once. The notebook, the conversation, the coffee, the old station wagon. Her face lost its color. Arthur wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at anyone. He simply continued. I don't blame the manager. Several people exchanged surprised glances. Arthur smiled sadly. She was doing exactly what she'd been rewarded for. Efficiency, speed, table turnover. He looked around the room. So today, I'd like to ask all of you a question. He let the silence linger. What are we rewarding? Nobody answered. Arthur picked up a menu from the table. He held it in one hand. This menu tells people what we serve. Then he gently placed his hand over his heart. But it doesn't tell them how we make them feel. He carefully set the menu back down. I spent 42 years believing those two things should never be separated. Another long silence followed. Finally, Arthur smiled. I still believe it. No one moved. No one spoke. Then, very quietly, Vanessa stood. Every eye turned toward her. She looked directly at Arthur. Her voice was barely above a whisper. It was my restaurant. Arthur nodded gently. Yes. She swallowed hard. She stopped, took a slow breath, then began again. I'm deeply sorry. Arthur looked at her with the same kindness he had shown her the previous afternoon. I know. Those 2 words surprised everyone in the room, including Vanessa. Arthur smiled. Otherwise you wouldn't have stood up. Silence. The chairman quietly leaned back in his chair. Nobody interrupted. This was no longer a business meeting. It had become a lesson. Arthur looked toward Vanessa again. Tell me, what did you think when you asked me to leave? Vanessa answered honestly. I thought you were another customer telling us how restaurants used to be. Arthur nodded. A fair assumption. She looked down. But I never asked why you were saying it. Arthur smiled. No, you didn't. Then, after a thoughtful pause, he added, and that's the mistake that concerns me. No one in the boardroom spoke. Arthur allowed the silence to settle. He had learned many years ago that people often discovered the truth for themselves if someone simply gave them enough time. Finally, he looked toward Vanessa. You've built one of our strongest restaurants. Vanessa looked up, surprised. The reports speak for themselves. He gently tapped the folder lying on the table. Lowest food waste. Excellent financial performance. Outstanding kitchen efficiency. She swallowed. Thank you. Arthur smiled. And yet, he let the word hang in the air. I left your restaurant, wishing I had spent less time there. The sentence landed softly, but everyone in the room understood it. Arthur continued. That's a strange thing to say about a restaurant. Vanessa nodded slowly. Yes, it is. Arthur walked toward the windows overlooking the city. For a moment he simply watched the people below. Then he spoke again. When my wife and I opened our first restaurant, we couldn't afford advertisements. We couldn't compete with larger businesses. We couldn't lower our prices. So we asked ourselves one question. He turned back toward the room. What can we give people that costs nothing? Nobody answered. Arthur smiled. We discovered the answer was being remembered. He looked around the table. A smile costs nothing. Learning a customer's name costs nothing. Helping an elderly guest with the door costs nothing. Listening for 2 extra minutes costs nothing. Then he looked directly at Vanessa. But those things become priceless when they're missing. Vanessa slowly stood again. I understand. Arthur smiled kindly. I don't think you do. She looked puzzled. You understand what happened. He paused. But I want you to understand why it happened as it did. He walked back to the head of the table. You measured everything that could be counted. She nodded. I did. You reduced waiting times. Yes. You improved efficiency. Yes. You increased profit. Yes. Arthur smiled. Excellent work. Vanessa looked confused. Then Arthur quietly asked, what did you measure when a lonely widower came in because he didn't want to eat by himself? Silence. What did you measure when a little girl proudly showed her drawing to a waitress? What did you measure when someone celebrated their golden wedding anniversary? Vanessa looked down. I couldn't. Arthur nodded gently. No, you couldn't. Because some of the most important things do not fit into spreadsheets. The room remained completely still. Finally, Arthur smiled again. Now, what shall we do about it? Several managers exchanged uncertain looks. Everyone expected an announcement, a suspension, a dismissal. Instead, Arthur looked at Vanessa. I have a proposal. She lifted her eyes. I'd like you to spend the next 6 months working 1 lunch shift every Friday. Vanessa blinked. She didn't understand. Arthur continued. No office. No management meetings. No reports. Just an apron and a name badge. A few people smiled. Arthur wasn't finished. And I'd like you to work beside one particular waiter. Ethan Brooks. Vanessa looked genuinely surprised. The new employee? Arthur nodded. The one who brought me coffee after I'd already left. He smiled. He reminded me why we opened restaurants. Vanessa thought about the young waiter. Only 2 weeks with the company. She had planned to coach him on speed. Arthur wanted her to learn from him. The irony wasn't lost on her. She gave a small, thoughtful smile. I'd be honored. Arthur nodded. I hoped you'd say that. One of the directors finally raised his hand. Mr. Bennett. Arthur looked toward him. Willems. Reed still received the promotion she was recommended for? The room became quiet once more. Arthur looked at Vanessa, then answered carefully. Not yet. Vanessa nodded before he had finished. I understand. Arthur smiled. I don't believe you do. She looked up. You haven't lost the promotion. You've postponed it. She frowned slightly. I have. Arthur nodded. Because when you become regional director, you won't simply manage restaurants. You'll shape the people who manage them. He smiled warmly. I'd like you to do that after you've remembered why we built them. Vanessa felt tears threatening for the first time that morning, not because she had been corrected, because someone still believed she could become better. She quietly nodded. I won't waste the opportunity. I know. Arthur smiled. That's why I offered it. Arthur looked around the room one final time. I have one last request. Everyone listened. Starting next Monday, every manager in this company will spend 1 hour each week serving guests. Not inspecting, not supervising, serving. Learning names, carrying plates, pouring coffee, listening. Several people smiled. Arthur smiled back. If leadership ever becomes too important to clear a table, it has stopped being leadership. The room erupted into spontaneous applause. Not because they had heard a brilliant business strategy, because they had been reminded why they had entered hospitality in the first place. The following Friday arrived quietly, exactly 1 week after Arthur Bennett had walked into the restaurant, carrying nothing more than a leather notebook and the hope of enjoying one peaceful lunch. The restaurant looked much the same. The same polished tables, the same flowers near the entrance, the same gentle hum of conversation. Yet something had changed. Not dramatically, almost invisibly, which was exactly how Arthur believed real change usually happened. As he climbed the short path toward the entrance, the heavy wooden door opened before he reached it. This time, Vanessa Reed was holding it. She smiled warmly. Good afternoon. She hesitated for only the briefest moment. Arthur. Arthur smiled. Good afternoon. For a second, neither of them moved. Then Vanessa quietly said, I'm glad you came back. Arthur nodded. So am I. Inside, Ethan was carrying a tray toward another table. He looked up. His face immediately brightened. You came back. Arthur laughed. I did. Ethan grinned. I've been hoping you would. Arthur looked around the dining room. It looks different. Ethan smiled. We've been trying something. Arthur noticed it almost immediately. One waitress knelt beside a little boy, who proudly showed her his drawing. She studied it, as though it belonged in an art gallery. The child beamed. An elderly couple walked through the door. Before they even reached the hostess stand, Vanessa smiled. Welcome back, Mr. and Mrs. Collins. The corner table? Mrs. Collins laughed. You remembered. Vanessa smiled. Of course. Arthur quietly watched. Nothing about the restaurant was slower. Orders still arrived quickly. The kitchen still worked beautifully. The difference was, people no longer felt like interruptions. They felt like guests. Ethan led Arthur toward the same corner booth. You know, Arthur smiled. I was hoping for this table. Ethan laughed. I had a feeling. Arthur looked surprised. You did? I've been saving it every Friday. Arthur looked at him. You've been saving it. Ethan shrugged. I thought. Just in case. Arthur felt something tighten gently in his chest. He looked away toward the window for a moment, before he could answer. I'm very glad you did. A few minutes later, Vanessa approached. She wasn't carrying a tablet, or checking the waiting list. She simply carried a steaming bowl of tomato soup. She carefully placed it on the table. Arthur looked at it in surprise. I thought this disappeared years ago. Vanessa smiled. It did. We found the original recipe. Arthur looked at the soup for a long moment. My wife would have approved. Vanessa smiled softly. I hope so. Arthur tasted the first spoonful. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he quietly laughed. It's not quite hers. Vanessa looked alarmed. No? Arthur smiled. It's better. She stared at him. Then both of them laughed. After lunch, Arthur asked for the bill. Vanessa placed the small folder beside him. He opened it. Inside, instead of an invoice, lay a handwritten note. It said, Thank you for reminding us why we opened the door in the first place. Your harvest table family. Arthur quietly folded the note, placed it inside the leather notebook. I'll keep this. Vanessa smiled. I hoped you would. As Arthur prepared to leave, Ethan walked him to the entrance. Can I ask you something? Arthur nodded. Of course. When you came in last week, did you already know what was going to happen? Arthur smiled. No. I honestly thought I was only coming for lunch. Ethan laughed. I'm glad you didn't leave angry. Arthur looked back into the restaurant. I wasn't worried about myself. I was worried we'd forgotten something. Ethan looked around the dining room. I think we remembered. Arthur nodded. So do I. He stepped outside. The afternoon sun warmed the old brick pavement. Before walking to his car, he turned for one last look. Through the large front windows, he saw Vanessa greeting another family. She crouched beside a little girl, listening carefully to something very important that only 6-year-olds consider important. Nearby, Ethan carried coffee to an elderly gentleman, not because the table needed serving, because the man looked lonely. Arthur smiled. 42 years earlier, he and his wife had opened a tiny restaurant with 4 tables and one simple dream. The buildings had grown larger. The menus had changed. The company had expanded beyond anything they had imagined. But the dream was exactly the same. He quietly slipped the little notebook back into his leather bag and walked toward his car. As he reached the driver's door, he looked back one final time. The restaurant wasn't perfect. It never would be. Restaurants weren't built by perfect people. They were built by people who remembered that every guest who walked through the door was someone's most important person. Arthur smiled, started the engine, and drove home. not because his work was finished, but because he finally knew it was in good hands.